everyone. Thank you for joining me here today. I'm so glad to be here on this beautiful Friday morning or afternoon, depending where you are. My name is Cindy McDonald, and I am an entrepreneur, I'm an educator, and now I'm also a producer. I live and reside in Central California, which is the part of California most people don't even know about, but I'm very proud to be here. And actually one of our guests today is also kind of comes from Central California, right, Joe? You're at least in the San Joaquin Valley, right?
Correct.
Although you're about 200 miles from me. So that just goes to show how big the San Joaquin Valley is. And I'm so glad to have 4 experts in working with athletes with me today. We have Amy Bryant from Bryant College Coaching, Joe Slater from Slater Advising, Katie Andersen, which you've heard from once or twice before, from College Fit OC, and Reid Meyer from Athletes to Athletes. And of course, we also have my good friend and colleague, Carmen Gallegos, who is going to be helping to monitor and keep everything going with the chats and the questions. As you log in, let's let my panel know who you are and where you're from. And then the other question that we want to ask is, what's your comfort level and working with student athletes? On a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable are you working with athletes? I know I asked this in my UCLA classes, and the range is quite varied, and a lot of it depends on the types of students you work with and also where they're located. So that's one of the things that we want to cover today, and we're going to talk about all the changes and just that moving target of college athletes. So as you log in, please just add into the chat your name, your location, and what's your comfort level on a level from 1 to 10 of working with athletes. And as you're logging in too today, remember, use the question and answer section. We'll answer questions as they come up. As we talk about this, it's a very fluid topic, but it's much easier if they're in the question and answer section than if you put it in the chat. So you can see we've got people already. Oftentimes, we get people here from Oregon, New York, Switzerland, Colombia. We have people from all over the country. So I'm glad to see all of you. I know that this is a very busy time of year, and so I'm just really grateful to have everybody. So as we're getting started, let's go ahead. I'm going to have each of you introduce yourselves, and as people are logging in, they'll be able to answer the questions. How did you become a specialist in working with athletes? So Joe, we're going to start with you. How did that happen for you?
Well, I was an athlete myself. I played baseball in college at Sonoma State in Northern California. And then I went overseas and played in Germany for 3 years and started coaching while I was out there and loved it. And was like, all right, this is, what I want to do for the rest of my life. And I lasted about 6 years. And then just kind of ran out of juice with the hours and the grind and trying to make it through. So I switched over to administration and started getting more into the admission side and really enjoyed that part. And eventually broke out and started working with athletes on my own.
Amy, what about for you?
Well, I lasted coaching a little bit longer than Joe. I made it. I was coaching for 23 years, and I was a 2-sport college athlete prior to that. So I transitioned over to helping student athletes just because of the relationships that I enjoyed. That Joe mentioned that as well. I really loved working with student athletes. It's the grind that gets us tired for sure as coaches, but I love the relationships that I formed with the student athletes that I worked with. So transitioning over to help student athletes with the recruiting process and finding the right fit seemed an easy jump for me. And then additionally, because of my position as a coach for as long as I had a lot of experience on the other side of the desk. recruiting these student athletes. So I know how coaches are thinking. I know how to translate what I call coach speak. And so I wanted to be able to share that knowledge and help with the student athletes that I work with as an IC.
Great, great. Reid, what about for you?
Yeah, hey everybody. I am a former college athlete myself. I played baseball in college, and I did not do any coaching, but I went to 4 schools in 4 years as a baseball player. I played at a Division I program, I played at a junior college program, and then actually chose to no longer continue my sport due to burnout and just other issues on that front, and graduated as a full-time student. So I sort of experienced it from a lot of different angles. And through that experience, decided to reconnect with my former college counselor to try to understand what I did wrong and how I ended up at 4 different schools. Something really clicked during that part of my life, and just really found a passion for connecting with student athletes in this capacity. I feel like I can make a difference here. And so I spent a lot of my time talking with other athletes, other college athletes, and trying to better understand what their processes were, and kind of understand that side of the game as well. So yeah, that's kind of how I got here.
Katie, what about for you? How did you get to this point?
I feel like I have a little bit of a sprinkling of a few of their different stories. So I've been a college counselor for the last 10 years. I'm based in Dana Point, California. I was a soccer player. I was recruited to play soccer at Duke University back in the 1980s. So that was quite a while ago. And like Reid, I had a college counselor. There weren't many people doing that at the time. But the gentleman that I worked with had no experience working with student athletes. And I think I got pretty lucky in that I wanted to go back east, and I was a good fit for the Duke women's soccer program. They were starting a brand new program the year that I was going to be starting as a freshman. So I was recruited. I played for 2 years, and then I left. I saw the writing on the wall. We were playing for the national championship on year 5. So the trajectory was pretty steep, and I just decided that I would rather be a regular student and do all the other things that I couldn't do as a student athlete. Went on study abroad, worked for the school newspaper, was an RA on my freshman hall. Anyway, after graduation, I went out and I worked in high tech for many years, ended up working for web design agencies and software companies, and built up a skill base for myself. So when I decided to start my own business, when I had 2 small kids at home, this is what I chose to do. I remembered my college counselor and actually reconnected with him as well as other people in the industry. And so when I got started, I did the UCLA program. And then soon after that, I actually connected with David Steckel, who unfortunately passed away back in 2021. But he and I worked together for a good 8 years or so, really trying to help counselors with understanding how to work with student athletes. And so recently, I've come in contact with Joe and Reid and Amy in the last year and a half or so, and really I felt like it was a good time to sort of to invite them into the student athlete advisors and be able to utilize all of our varying experience to help families. I felt like we all had a similar philosophy around this. So I'm super excited that you have been so kind to always invite us and to talk about this subject, because it's quite important. So thank you.
Well, it is something that we get asked all the time is, my child wants to play, baseball or water polo or whatever the sport is. And as you see from our chat, many of us get those questions, but we don't have that knowledge or expertise. So we're really glad to have you here, and we'll be sharing more because you have a course available. Many of you work in collaboration with counselors, both independents and even school counselors, if they need it. Is that correct? I see shaking heads. Good.
Yep.
So Katie, tell us what has changed. I mean, you've been doing this for such a long time. What has changed in athletic recruitment, especially in the last 3 years? Because, with COVID and everything, things have just really shifted. What does that look like?
Sure. Well, I'll kick it off, but I'm also going to ask everybody else to kind of chime in with their thoughts on this one as well. Well, one thing that has changed post COVID, and it sort of started happening during COVID, but then the change became more permanent, is just the SAT and ACT no longer being part of the eligibility center. That was a change that was made a couple years ago, and it has stuck. For Division One, NCAA Division One and Division Two schools, that where if you were being a recruited athlete, you sort of had to be aware of the fact that there was this sliding scale related to GPA and test scores. And now that the NCAA has decided to remove the test score piece of it, families get confused because they don't know whether they really need to take the test. Does their child need to pursue this? And so my general advice, again, asking where are kids applying to college and where do they think they want to go? If they want to stay in California and they want to stay with a California public school, we all know that they don't take test scores anyway. So that's a consistent one. But then with other opportunities, you may find that having a test, at least having a score recorded, could be helpful. Again, it really depends on your situation. And then there are some schools out there that still are now requiring the test again. So just because athletically the NCAA eligibility center says you don't need it for eligibility purposes doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't need it or could use it to your advantage in college admissions. So
Katie, so let me make this clear because I didn't know this. So you think that this is going to, like, they're not going to go back to requiring SAT or ACT? This is not a trial period like some colleges still have it, that this will be a permanent change?
My take on it is that this is something that was decided, they tested it out for a little while and then they made this decision. They voted on it and decided to remove it. I'd be curious to know if anybody else has a different take on that, but my understanding was this was going to be a permanent change. Anybody else disagree?
Yeah, let's hear what your guys' thoughts are on this change, because this is huge. It's huge for parents and students. And does that apply to international students as well as domestic students?
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think that what you're seeing from a lot of the colleges and what they're stating is that they're doing research, in-depth research on how their students with no test scores are performing against the students with test scores. And the NCAA is not doing that, like in a grand scale across everything. So I think they've made just more of a blanket, like, we're not going to be requiring this moving forward. And, that's just for, as Katie was saying, that's just for eligibility purposes. And it's up to, usually a lot of times, coaches will indicate pretty early on in the recruiting process whether they think a test score is going to be something that would help, a student, and they'll be pretty clear, like, hey, I think you should take a test if you want a better chance of making it into a school like this.
So it becomes part of the admissions, not the eligibility to play their sport.
Yeah.
And before the scale, go ahead, Amy.
Oh, I was just going to say that this is just for the NCAA that we're talking about. There are other governing bodies in college athletics that are still requiring, or not requiring per se, but using standardized test scores as an eligibility kind of check box. So in order to be eligible, you can have a certain score plus a certain GPA. So they still have a sliding scale in process. The NAIA is one of those. And I know there's one other as well, and it's just slipping my mind. If anyone recalls, please pipe in.
USCAA, possibly?
Maybe so, yeah. So it's not a requirement. What is USCAA? That is the, all of these acronyms, and I always get them wrong. It is the United States College Athletic Association. Did I get it right?
That's what I put my money on.
Okay. It is, and there's more. There's the NAI, there's the USCA, there's the Christian College Athletic CCAAA, I think is that one, Athletic Association. So there's the USCAA and the CCCAA are very small. We're talking 90 to 100 schools, whereas the NCAA has about 1,000 schools in it. Am I right? 900,000. Okay, so definitely NCAA is the biggest governing body out there, but there are other options for student athletes that are worth noting.
So I think NAIA is the next largest one, but that's for smaller schools, correct?
Actually,
Correct.
actually NJCAA is the next largest one.
Oh, good. Oh, good to know.
It's bigger than NAIA. Yeah, it has
Okay.
more schools than the NAIA. So yeah, and that's junior college, community college.
Mhm. Okay.
I just wanted to add because I saw a comment from Jeffrey in the chat. And this is just to say, piggyback on what Amy was just saying regarding test scores and NCAA Division I, Division II, and Division III. So with NCAA Division III, the eligibility center, Division III does not use the eligibility center for evaluating academic eligibility, and therefore test scores, again, given that they are helpful, they oftentimes at least as good as or better than a GPA would indicate, could be helpful in possibly getting merit awards. And there may be other ways that they're evaluating those, but certainly if you have very strong test scores, that could be very helpful, especially at a Division III school where they don't have athletic scholarships and where they don't use the eligibility center for that purpose.
Right, that makes sense. Well, I always looked at the test scores on the NCAA as kind of a double-edged sword. And I think a lot of coaches was like, well, if your grades are a little low, then you can bump it up with a higher test score. And then the minimums on those test scores, if your grades were at a certain level, were like ludicrous. I mean, you just had to take the test. You didn't get anything right. So do you feel like, and Rita, I'm going to ask you this question, do you feel like especially NCAA has taken that barrier away of that factor, because it could become a barrier for a lot of students, but as Katie said, it was very complicated. So what do you see as the motivation behind the college besides COVID and all that? What's the outcome going to be?
Yeah, I think COVID obviously forced, colleges, the eligibility center, sort of all these different institutions to make a change and to see what this was going to look like. And everybody kind of sat back and evaluated what that impact was going to be. In my opinion, one of the biggest pieces, to your point, is accessibility and is sort of barrier to entry. I think that colleges saw that. Colleges saw an uptick in applications. They saw an uptick in enrollment opportunities for families that couldn't afford to take the tests either at all or multiple times. I think on the same way, when you talk about sports and athletics, so many families try to use athletics as a way to get to certain schools or to get into college as a whole, and to take away that additional barrier, so long as they're not seeing a substantive drop in graduation rates or in, a steady retention rate impact or anything like that, there's not any need for them to add an additional rule or an additional sort of standard that you have to meet back into the eligibility center in order to make that harder for families to access that opportunity. So I think a lot of it stems from that. If the numbers keep going up and we're not seeing a notable drop or dip in quality or opportunity for these kids, then why would we reinsert another obstacle to have them jump through?
Right. Well, and that's good. I think that's very valuable. And isn't it beneficial to the coaches to have a larger pool of students to pull from? So what else has changed? We've talked about the SAT and ACT. What other changes have been implemented in the last years? Joe, let me ask you that. I know you just put your mic on. So
I was going to say, kind of the most well-known one is probably NIL, and the ability for student athletes to make money off of their name, image, and likeness, and how that's affecting different levels of student athletes. Different the stories that you hear in the on the news are about the guys that are making $7 million a year, quarterbacks at the biggest programs, but it is also affecting the average student athlete. The majority of student athletes are Division III student athletes, because there are so many more schools. And I just think about back when I was a Division II baseball player, at a school with 6,000 people, like how, the ability to, it's not that I would have been able to make a ton of money, but maybe I would have been able to make a deal, to get free pizza once a week from a local pizza joint for posting on my social media, and how big of a difference that would have made for me as a broke college student. And there's just all of these interesting ideas that are coming out and allowing student athletes to be really, entrepreneurial with things. There's a benefit and a drawback, of everyone branding themselves, and the mental health aspect of all of that. I know I saw a great presentation by Katie and Amy last year about some of those things. But it's really interesting for student athletes because I think last time I checked, it's, business is the most common major for student athletes, and giving them this interesting ability to start to understand, marketing and making deals and things like that is an awesome opportunity. But it's also kind of the Wild West right now. And so the NCAA and some lawmakers and things like that are really starting to look into how can we put some structures around this thing to protect these kids from predatory people.
Well, and that's definitely because this was such a rule, and then when it was overturned by the Supreme Court and implemented through a Supreme Court ruling a case, then it did open it up for the wild west. So what are some of the controversy? You alluded to some of that, but what are some of the cons of having the name, likeness, and image? What are some things that people are colleges or others people are talking about?
I think that anytime there's this much money sloshing around, you're going to attract bad actors, and there's just people there. You're talking about, an unsophisticated group of people like, college kids who are out there, and there are people coming to them and being like, I'm going to make you a ton of money if you just do this. And there's just so many ways that can go wrong, and has already gone wrong. And so it's, really incumbent on, the NCAA and the states and the federal government to, help protect them, from people who are going to come in and, do something that's either going to ruin their eligibility or, potentially be illegal,
Wow. So that means that we as counselors, advisors need to be aware of some of that, or helping, just like we teach our students to be aware of marketing and that it's pointed at them, that they need to be aware of that. So Amy or Katie, how does that look for you guys?
Amy, you want to take that one? Okay, so when Amy and I did the presentation last year, it was, we tried to talk about all these various aspects, but one of them was the mental health part of what it means to make yourself into a brand, to have to care every single day about posting on social media. I mean, as it is, I stress out about social media. I can't, when you now think of yourself as being, a brand that has to be managed, and putting yourself out there and now attached to potentially a product or a service that you're providing, that can have its own, and not only that, but inviting commentary on that, right? If you put yourself out there, you have to be prepared for what might come back at you. And it's one thing when you're an adult and you've got a thick skin and you've kind of been, battered a little. But it's another thing to be a student athlete who's just starting to kind of just get started in this space. And so again, I think that the mental health part of it is critical for those for those student athletes who might want to start going down that path. I know, Reid, you've done some work to partner with a company or two in that space. I don't know if you want to talk about that in terms of how those companies, especially why you've chosen to work with some of them and not others.
Yeah. The NIL is the soapbox that you could talk about forever. So I'm going to keep it as direct as I possibly can on that. I think speaking, sort of two main points on the NIL piece. I think number one, on the mental health side, having a support group and having a community of people that understand what it is you're working through and how to manage that and how to sort of have some context in your life around that is really important. There's a company called Morgan's Message. It's a nonprofit that has essentially groups all over campuses across the country, built for student athletes. It's built to be a space where they can discuss things that they're struggling with, unrelated or unrelated to NIL, just as a student athlete in that experience. That is a place that I always encourage student athletes that I work for. Hey, if you can find this group on your campus, if you feel that would be a beneficial community for you to just gain some grounding in your life, that's certainly something that would be a benefit. Speaking on the NIL part and some more of the economic and the business model concept, we're asking 17, 18, 19-year-old kids to become business owners. We're asking them to become contractors. And one of the biggest things that I think a lot of these kids run into in that space is that, first off, they're focusing on, like Joe said, the 2% of people that we talk about in the space of NIL don't apply to the 98% of people that are experiencing it as the people that get free pizza or the people that make a post and get $40 or whatever it might be. But they come into school with no understanding of their own financial literacy and of basic tax law. And that's where a lot of these kids get caught up, because and these are bigger examples just to sort of showcase the meat of the issue. But the University of Utah just recently had a deal with their football team where all scholarship athletes get a free truck, which is a crazy thing to say out loud. But nobody in that room, I promise you, asked, like, is this a lease? Is this a gift? Do I own this? Am I paying taxes on this on the set? Nobody in that room is asking that question. Maybe one person is. And so come April, they're going to find out whether that is the case. There are kids that, the other example there's other kids at LSU right now, and obviously not going to say specific names, but we've got some six-figure tax bills that are overdue at LSU right now on some football, basketball, baseball players who quite literally did not know they had to file taxes. They were under the impression that these things were gifted to them, so they took them as gifts. That doesn't count as anything towards my, they went and did like a speaking engagement or something like that. They don't view it as something they need to put on their tax record or as a contractor. And so I think what student athletes have to do as part of that responsibility, regardless of where they land, is you've got to educate yourself on the basic financial literacy and the basic tax laws of what are going to apply to you if you want to get involved with anything from an NIL perspective. And there's a couple companies out there that I think do a pretty good job of helping kids get some guardrails. From a platform perspective, there's a company called FanWord that tries to regulate a lot of the contract agreements that people do, and so you're not getting taken advantage of by different groups. The Players NIL has an online course for kids. It's very built around, branding and understanding, health and social media, financial literacy. So those are a couple groups that, from the hundreds and hundreds that seem to want to sell kids things on this stuff, those seem to be folks that have the right philosophy in mind for trying to protect those student athletes.
Oh, that's great, Reid. And can you put those links or give them to Carmen so that we can share those for those organizations? I know one other thing that has been a big impact for athletes in the last few years is the transfer portal. So, Amy, tell us a little bit about why that's significant and what change or impact that has had.
Sure. So in 2018, the NCAA launched the transfer portal, which is an online database. So prior to that, student athletes, if they wanted to transfer, it was a much more laborious process. They had to speak to their coach, and then they had to go basically through the whole recruiting process all over again, try to find a new home. In 2018, all they had to do was let their compliance office know, at their admissions office, that they were going to enter, or at their athletic office, that they were going to enter the transfer portal, and then they're in there. And so coaches can go shopping. It's like Amazon for athletes. Like, we would go in there and shop for, let's see who went to a similarly selected school as our school and see who's available. And, oh, I want to talk to that person. And we would then get the information for that person and reach out to them. So there's this online database now that just makes transferring so much easier than it used to be. So we're seeing a lot more kids transfer. The other thing that we're seeing is coaches doing a very proactive job of recruiting transfers instead of recruiting high school juniors and seniors, because transfers are more mature. They have at least a year or two, sometimes 3 years under the belt of playing for somebody else. They understand what it means to play on a team. They're bigger, stronger. So why wouldn't they recruit out of the transfer portal and get somebody that can just step right onto the field and go and doesn't require that much effort. So what that's doing is that's making it much more competitive for our juniors and seniors to get recruited to be an athlete and to step right on the field as a freshman. It's just pretty rare in a lot of sports now. The other thing that happened with transfers is a couple years ago, the NCAA said that the main sports, football, basketball, and there's a couple others in there, if you transferred in those sports, you no longer had to sit out what's called an academic year in residence before you could play. Now these transfers can just step their foot right on campus and start playing. That was only for some sports. That wasn't for all sports. Other sports could step right on and play, but those sports, the big ones, now can just go from one season to the next playing at different schools, and they don't have to sit out. There's no penalty. There's no nothing. As long as they were in good academic standing at their previous school, they could step right on the field at a new school and play. So these are all things that have kind of shaped the athletics recruiting world in a different way as well.
So that does have a lot of impact. So does that mean that their eligibility has increased, or they, like, if they played for 1 year and then transfer, that still counts as one of their eligibility years? How has that affected their eligibility in terms of the amount of time they can play?
You still have the same amount of time to play.
Okay.
That doesn't change. And the eligibility, the amount of time that, like, your eligibility clock is what it's called in Division I. It starts at the same time and it ends at the same time. But within that time frame, you can transfer schools as many times as you want. The eligibility clock looks a little different in Division II and Division III than it does in Division I. So you can space things out. You have a certain amount of semesters to conclude the allowable semesters. So I don't want to get too technical into all of that stuff, but no, to answer your question, the simple answer is no, they still have the same amount of time to play.
And as you mentioned earlier, this is an NCAA product or program that doesn't apply to some of the other, like NAIA, or does the junior college, does that participate in the transfer portal as well, though? Even though that's not,
they do not participate in the transfer portal is specific to the NCAA. Okay. So but I will say that the other other athletic governing bodies do have their own rules on transferring that would need to be explored.
So I want to see what other people, it looks like, Carmen, you have a question.
Yes, so there's a question in the chat. Are you seeing mostly within NCAA division transfer or between? Is this prevalent in D3?
Okay, I'm sorry. Mostly within NCAA division. Oh, like Division I transfers. Okay. Sorry, I'm struggling to understand the question. Transferring is occurring at every division in the NCAA. So I haven't seen it necessarily more or less from my position where I'm standing. It's just much more accessible now for students. So I'm seeing it more across the board.
I think
does that answer the question?
It's kind of changing a little bit of the way that it used to work too. Like at a Division II school, under the old rules, if you transferred within the division D1 to D1, you had to sit out a year. If you transferred from D1 to D2, you did not have to sit out a year. And so our Division II school was stocked full. We called them bounce backs. Like every year our coaches would come in and they'd be like, oh, this Long Beach guy and this, and a Berkeley guy and all these different people, were bringing them in, and that was just a huge pool. And now all of a sudden D1 can transfer to D1 and D2 has completely lost that group of people. And so there's just with the transfer portal, like Amy was saying, there's just ripple effects going through the whole system as kids are just moving around all over the place. And that's affecting the high school athletes. It's affecting, D2, D3. It's all over the place and they're trying to figure it out.
Reid, you are one of those people who transferred a lot. So what do you see as this? What effects or impact do you see?
Yeah, so I was pre-transfer portal. So I for baseball, I went down to JUCO and then back up. But I think, to piggyback on top of what everyone has said, from what I noticed, the biggest sort of impact on the transfer portal side is that the goalposts have changed, and they're changing at such a rate that I have kids that I'm working with now that are seniors and juniors that saw friends of theirs go to certain schools or saw their skill sets go to certain divisions or go to certain conferences or whatever it might be. And now they may or may not have those same opportunities because those schools have discovered they can find somebody who's 20 years old. They can play that position the way that it couldn't have been found 2 or 3 years ago. And so having to readjust some of those priorities, and having to have conversations with kids about expanding those different opportunities and looking further than just schools they recognize or schools that they've been dreaming of putting on their Twitter account since they were in 8th grade is something that's a much more needed conversation in sort of helping kids understand the breadth of opportunity at that level. That to me is the biggest impact of the transfer portal is you've narrowed the opportunity for high school kids, because looking at a 17 or 18-year-old guess is a lot different than looking at a 19 or 20-year-old established product. And with COVID years and with medical red shirts and with academic, whatever it might be, clearly it's the outlier, not the norm. But you do have kids that are in college right now that are on year 6 and year 7 by combining these waivers. And so sometimes those spots just aren't available, and they're not going to be available for as long as that kid's going through the recruiting process.
Wow. Well, and that's one of the things, Amy, that you said that I'm glad you addressed, Reid, is recruiting for a freshman. Now the whole landscape has totally changed with this whole transfer portal. And, if coaches aren't looking at freshmen, then how do we as college advisors, we're working with high school students, what does that look like for them as they're preparing to and planning to play a sport in college? So how does that shift how we advise students?
I'll chime in on this one. And I think the key goes back to building a balanced recruiting list and setting expectations with families very early on. The sooner that you can educate your families about all of these various factors that are completely 100% out of their control, that this is where you have to, make sure that they're aware of it. And that the reason that we suggest, creating a range of options, not just one particular kind of school or the best of the best, is because there are no guarantees in, where, again, your student athlete's talent matches with a college program. And even though, again, you may have friends that got recruited at such and such school or a big name, this, that, and the other. Again, all of these different factors on what a coach is looking for, how many transfers they brought in, what they're looking for, in the next couple of years. The student athlete has no control over that. So again, just building that balanced recruiting list. And that means looking at a range of athletic options across various divisions, because there is, Division I is not better than Division II or better than Division III, right? That athletically, there are plenty of teams, in these divisions who could compete with each other on a field and be, where you'd find that Division III teams could be better than Division I teams. And so that's not the issue here. It's really about finding that fit. And again, given that we don't have control over which coaches might be interested in recruiting us, you have to cast a wide net early on to find out where that fit really does exist. Wow. Anybody else have thoughts?
One thing I want to just kind of slightly add to that, and it's the more I've kind of thought about it over time, this is the way I like to approach this. I'm sure we all have different but similar approaches to it, is when I think about certain families, I need to get a gauge of, is your expectation as a student athlete or as a family, do you like the idea of playing Power 5 college athletics, which is the main, Division I programs in the NCAA, or do you want to play college athletics? Because those are two different conversations. And to me, it's a similar thing of, if you're working with a family, do you only want to go Ivy or do you want to go to college? And it's sort of that same kind of thing where, like, those are two different conversations one of which provides some context and some hard truths. And then we can approach that conversation of, hey, if you only want to go to these 5 conferences and play this sport, we need to have a very good conversation of that. The percentages of that happening, regardless of who you are and where you are different. So you got to be comfortable with that rejection and that alignment. If you want to play college athletics, now let's open up the book a little bit and have a conversation and explore all of our options. And so I think figuring out which one of those roads families truly and kids truly want to be on helps you know how to move forward in that conversation.
I love that, Reid. That is, do you want to play sports, or do you want to go, do you want to play your sport or go to the Power 5 or, the Ivy of the college, the sports colleges? And I think that's a very important aspect. And I think that's what we as advisors do, is try to educate families and manage those expectations, as you said, Katie, and help dispel some of those myths. And there are so many myths around sports. And, we won't have time to get into all of them at all. So I can see an encore coming already in terms of this topic. And I've always had 3 questions for students and families. Why do you want to play a sport in college? Is it because you want to become a professional player, whatever sport it is? And not very many sports offer that as an option, first of all, right? And that's one answer, as you said. Another one is, do you think it's going to get you money? That's another answer. Do you think it's going to help you get in? Maybe you're not quite as good of a student, but if you go there and play a sport, maybe that'll help you get in. I think that's where the SAT or ECT, issue comes in. And then the other one is do you just want to play your sport? And that does change the whole conversation. And so many families have put so much money into their children playing a sport because they think it's going to help them get money, and they're going to have a full ride because they're going to go play football at CU Boulder, and that's going to pay for their education. But we know that that's not the case. The amount of money that students get in scholarships is not nearly as much as people expect. So, but understanding those motivations is key. So Carmen, go ahead. You have a question.
So we have a question in the chat. To what extent, as college counselors, do you suggest adding colleges to the list where the students would not pursue their sport at a varsity level?
I can jump in. So we all have a pretty similar philosophy of we always want to have, the backup plan. And, it's not only just that they didn't, things didn't work out the way they wanted. It's like injuries happen and, life happens. And, a lot of students a lot of athletes want to go to big schools with big football teams, even if they're, a baseball player or a soccer player or something like that. And so it's always important to have, that recruiting list and tracking all the schools that you're talking to and the coaches you're speaking with and a nice balanced list. But then also on the side to have hey, if your sport was off the table, would you still be picking these same schools? And you ideally want those 2 types of lists to be as similar as possible, that you're playing at the schools that you would want to go to. But that's not always how it happens. And so having that backup, having that, academic only option and going through the application process for those schools is always important.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So now I'm wondering, with all these changes, well, first of all, are there any other changes in the sports from the last 3 years that we haven't mentioned that we should bring up? Because we've talked about NIL, the transfer, the SAT, ACT. Is there anything else?
It's kind of washing out of the system right now, but just that the COVID 5th year of eligibility, that's sort of, I feel like there's just, you can feel it. Certain rosters are still a little larger than, they're still hanging on to players, but that's kind of coming to an end. That's sort of starting to wash out of the system a bit. But I think it was Reid who mentioned, you still hear about these people who are on their they're somehow managed to do a 6th or 7th year because they've managed to they hit the timing right, and they managed to use waivers in a way that it allowed them to extend things out. I do think that we're seeing with that, and a question came up amongst our group, I think it was today, about graduate students. It's not uncommon now. You see it all over TV. Oh, so and so is a graduate student. Came in last year of eligibility. Playing that out as a graduate student. So, but I think that's starting to kind of wash out of the system a little bit now, because those students have moved on.
Oh, good. Well, that's interesting. As we get farther and farther removed from the COVID pandemic, you're going to see that those things trickle out. So I'm wondering, go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to say, one other thing that I've seen as a result of the COVID pandemic is, and where we are now, is we still have students that just don't feel prepared for college yet. Like they need, and this is not specifically related to athletes, of course, this is related to students as well, but it definitely plays into their athletics recruiting in terms of they're not, emotionally ready and mature enough for college. And then they're looking at gap year programs or PG year programs. And there are plenty of options for our student athletes in both of those areas. And actually we're doing a presentation at the next ICA convention on non-traditional routes outside of college for student athletes. So we'll share more about that then, but that's one thing that I've really seen this year is a lot of parents asking, this year in particular, a lot of parents asking about the gap year or PG year.
So explain what a PG year is, Amy.
Sure. So a PG year is a postgraduate year where students are allowed to play a 5th year of high school sports for almost every sport. There are certain rules on how long you can be out before your clock starts, which I mentioned before. And the rules vary dependent on the sport. But if you play a 5th year of high school, it does not count against you. For most sports, you then have to enroll in a college right after that, because your clock does start. Again, differences in D1, D2, D3, but for the most part, we're talking about they have 1 year to play another year of high school. So they'll go to some of these grad schools that offer the 5th year, the PG year program, where they're getting more academics, they're getting executive functioning skills to prepare them for college. Anything that the parents or the child feels like they've missed by losing that year or two. And then they also have another year to get bigger, stronger, play their sport, have another chance at recruiting. I typically don't guide families towards that option just because I don't believe that hope is a strategy in the recruiting process, and really like taking another year doesn't necessarily mean that you will get recruited. You know what I mean? Like they're hoping that they will, but I would guide a family to it if I felt like all of the other pieces were in line for that. Like if they would benefit from the academic, another year of academics, another year of maturity, all of that stuff, then I would recommend it.
That makes sense. That makes total sense. And I think postgraduate years, is that more common in private schools than public schools?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. I don't know of any public schools that offer PG years. So we're looking at boarding schools, mostly. Yeah. And so, not all boarding schools have the PG year option, only some do.
Right. So you're already looking at a very select group of, so it's not really an accessibility item either for students.
Right. Yeah.
But it is definitely something to be aware of. And I have heard coaches and both high school and college coaches talk about that. Okay, Carmen, go ahead.
So Claire asked if you can discuss walk-ons and if coaches let admissions know they're interested even though the student is not a recruit.
So what about walk-ons? Is that even possible now based on all of this?
I can lead us off because I was a walk-on. and I don't think the other three of you were, because I think they were all recruited athletes. So yeah, walk on is still very much a thing. All a walk on means is that you're not a scholarship athlete, and you're not signing an NLI, a national letter of intent, and a scholarship agreement with the school. So, I just think about baseball. When I was coaching baseball in Division I, it was, we had 11.7 scholarships that were allowed to be split up between 27 players on a 35-man roster. And so that meant every year that there were 8 slots for student athletes who were not receiving a scholarship at a minimum. And then we always, if you go into the year with a 35, when you declare your roster at 35, we generally started with like 40 to 45 people, and whittled that down a little bit and had some cuts and things like that. And those were all, the walk-ons, so we generally had about 15 walk-ons starting the fall and would end with 8, and so it's a tough road. It took, for me personally, a long time to crack, into that roster and into the starting lineup eventually. But it's a route that a lot of counselors are going to be, discussing with students, and it's really about, going through the application process as a normal student, and getting into schools. The more schools you get into, the more opportunities that you have to potentially be a walk-on, the better. The harder schools to get into, the better chance you have. I generally tell kids, like, hey, if you get into Cal State Northridge, are you the best baseball player that got into Cal State Northridge on his own this year on his academic merits? Like, there's probably a lot of people that did that, but if you get into Stanford, how many are you the best person that got into Stanford as a student this year? Like, you might be the best baseball player. And so the coaches at those schools are going to be a little bit more inclined to be interested in talking to you. So the academic side, that's really where the academic side comes in, is when a student's not on scholarship. What types of schools can they get into? And then they just reach out to the coaches and say, hey, I'm in and I would love to come and play at your school if you have the room for me, and try to figure out, which opportunity is the best.
I'm going to chime in briefly on this as well. And Amy and Joe are going to be a lot better at speaking on the coach side of the table. But I think from the student perspective, the term walk on, I think it's stigmatized a lot in athletics. And the vast majority of kids, a huge majority of kids that are playing college athletics are walk-ons, to Joe's point. It's just, that's how the numbers work out in a lot of these places. Technically, if you're a Division III athlete, you're a walk-on because there's not a scholarship involved. Technically, if you're an Ivy League athlete, you're a walk-on because there's not a scholarship involved. So that term is broad and far-reaching in a lot of places. I think for a lot of our kids, I know a lot of the kids that I work with, there is a expectation or a thought that a scholarship equals value, or a scholarship equals pedigree in whatever you're doing. And so what I try to talk to a lot of my kids about is, like, do you want to be a walk-on at a school that you love, or a scholarship athlete at a school that you are only going to because they're giving you $4,000 in athletic aid that you're now tied to, that coaches can't technically take away from you because they can't, based on your athletic performance, but they can definitely adjust the amount of money they give you year over year based on whatever they want. That's the conversation I think that needs to happen from that standpoint of, like, is that $4,000 or whatever worth you being able to tell your friends that you got a scholarship to play this sport? Or do you want to tell somebody, I'm going to be an athlete at X school, and be excited about all the other aspects that come with that school itself? So when you're thinking about kids that feel very strongly about, I got to have a scholarship to go somewhere, I got to have a scholarship to play sports, I'd really encourage them to expand sort of their understanding of what a walk-on is and what that can provide to you at a school.
I agree.
And I'll just add to that as well, that this concept of being sort of a preferred walk-on, meaning that the coach, going back to the relationship between coaches and the admissions department, that for those schools where a coach can say, look, I don't have any money for you, but I can support you in admissions, that is also an option. That's what happened to me. And that conversation is one that as the student athlete progresses through the relationship with a coach who's recruiting you, you need to understand where you stand with that coach and their willingness to support, the support to application and admissions. There's a lot of, I think Amy mentioned coach speak, and you just have to kind of understand. Sometimes there are some fine tuning of words that get used and misunderstood by families in terms of what a coach is actually saying to their admissions department. I have had kids who have gone through the recruiting process and were told by a coach, I'm supporting you in admissions. And then the day before the deadline, the coach calls and says, you know what, I've got another kid who needs my support. And I was told by my admissions department during the pre-read process that you are good to go, no problems. And then all of a sudden the admissions decision comes back and it's not quite what everyone expected, right? So there are lots there are lots of nuance in that discussion, but hopefully that just extends that that response.
Well, and it just demonstrates how fickle this process is, and how having a real clear understanding. There's no we talk about transparency in college admissions. There is no transparency in the sports side of this at all. And so working with someone that can help families manage expectations, understand it, and give some kind of clarity is key. So we have time for one more question. Oh, Carmen, I see the question. And then I just want to have you each share your contact information, and we're going to talk about, Katie, why don't you talk about the course that you guys are starting and such. So Carmen, go ahead.
I've heard recently about Ivy League recruiting a current high school senior, class of 24, but not starting for the class of 24, but for the class of 25, with no formal gap year or PG year planned. How would you advise a student on this?
So basically the Ivy Leagues are coming in and saying, we're recruiting, you'll come as a freshman, but you'll be part of the sport in the class of 2025.
There, coaches get creative, and there are different things you can do, and a lot of times it depends too on like when the season falls in the school year. So a team, I am just finishing up with a student who's a volleyball player at a UC, and the volleyball starts at the beginning of the year, so their season's over in November, December, and so she's going to come in as a 2024, and I think it might be called gray shirt. I can never remember all the colors of all the shirts. There are like 5 of them now. But there's blue shirt, green shirt, red shirt, gray shirt. But the plan is no scholarship, not playing fall of freshman year. I believe taking like 11 units to stay under the 12-unit full-time student threshold, and then starting as a full-time student in the spring on scholarship. And then the 4-year clock goes, from spring of 2024, then she'll play the fall and then do it. It's like, so yes, this is the kind of thing that's happening. And, there's a lot, it's totally different sport to sport. A lot of times you have to rely on the coaches to, understand how exactly it works at their school. And it's a place where, there's just a lot of gray area.
Talk about not transparent and talk about complicated. Oh my gosh. Well, that's why we need experts like you guys to help our students to navigate this. Because how am I, as a counselor or a school counselor, going to understand or know any of this? There's just the chips are moving so fast that it's hard to keep up. So tell us about the course and how you collaborate with people, Katie.
Great. Well, and this is version 2 of this course. Dave and I had originally recorded this as an 11-hour webinar series, and now we've, together with Amy, Reid, and Joe, we have sort of rehashed the entire thing given it a new face with our 4 various perspectives. And I'm hoping that and really kind of brought it up to speed with, current rules and regulations. So this our website is thestudentathleteadvisors.com. And the courses right now, it's targeted at, it's really meant for IECs who are interested in expanding their knowledge of the athletics recruiting space and process. The pricing is $495 for the course. And once you've purchased it, you will have ongoing access to that. And if you are watching this here on Cindy's Friday Forum, our special offer, you can use a code that we created when you purchase the course. You put in Friday Forum, all caps, one word, and that will indicate to us that you came to us through the Friday Forum, and we're offering with one of us a free 30-minute kind of advising session. You can talk about current clients that you have or just general questions. As part of the course, you would, of course, have access to our discussion forum where you can ask as many questions as you want, and we will, we're all taking turns kind of responding to you. But this would be a one-on-one session with one of us. So we're excited about it, and we've just recently launched it. So we hope that more and more counselors will take advantage. And even for, if you were somebody in the past who's taken the course, we've updated the content a fair amount, and it's, I think it's still a valuable opportunity, whether you know nothing about athletics or whether you feel like you've got a firm grasp on what you're doing, but just want to kind of get a understanding of what might have changed in the last few years. It's great for everybody.
That sounds wonderful, Katie. And I can see it. Somebody's already signed up. She said, Allison, she'd already signed up. And I love you as my audience for the Friday Forum. And so that's why I love bringing these opportunities and having Katie and Reid and Amy and Joe know that you came from the Friday Forum audience. So that's why you get this free 30-minute consultation that other people don't. So thank you very much. And again, thank you, Joe, Katie, Reid, and Amy had to run. She was doing this as she's catching a plane. So that's true dedication. And thank you for being here today. And we will have all the links to your emails to the Student Athletes Advisors website. They'll be on our show notes for in the next few days. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
And everyone, join me again in 2 weeks. We're going to be talking with Peter Lambert. He's going to talk about from a marketing perspective and how much we should be listening. I talk to consultants all the time, and we're always striving to tell everybody about what we have to offer and what our services are. And I'm on a mission to flip that narrative. Katie and I did a survey that really demonstrated what our messages are. And Peter's going to talk about how important the 80-20 listening rule is. So join us. The time's going to be a little different because I have to catch a plane that day. I realized this morning. So we'll start it at 10:30 California time. So we'll start a half an hour early. So everybody, again, thank you for being here, and have a great weekend. And I look forward to seeing you the next time.